hello, folks. This is actually a week after the debate that we had in California, myself and David Wood. In some ways, debates like that, though they were not planned, that was an unplanned debate. We really just did it at the last moment. George Saig approached me and approached David. I was going to go already do a talk on this newest material that people like Mel, who you see right there, Mel and Murad and Bala from Sneakers Corner, and also I got another guy named Joe who's kind of coming in with that group. I was going to introduce their material, and at this conference there in California, and George said, well, wait a minute, I think that David debated this way back in 2012. And I said, yeah, he did it with Robert Spencer. He said, well, let's make it into a debate. Let's just have a debate since you both have opposing views and you don't agree with each other. Let's go ahead and do that. So he called up David. David agreed to it. And so we decided that we would do this debate. And he planned his side, I planned my side, and we came together. Now, what happened in that debate, it became a great platform. In some ways, we weren't planning to really move into this whole a problem of did Muhammad exist or not, and this whole thing of whether or not the Muhammad of the 9th century is the Muhammad of the 7th century. We weren't going to do that at this time. That was something we were kind of reserving for a later time, but it worked perfectly and it fell right into our laps. And because of that, in some ways, David did us a real favor, because he came flying out with this idea that this whole premise that Muhammad of the 9th century is nothing of more than a myth, and so we were the myth makers, we were the conspiratists, and he made a big enormous amount of noise about the fact that these myth makers, and he even put the dunce caps, so there was silver caps of a group of us, and that's what you're looking at. These guys are just myth makers. These are conspiratists, and they are the worst. They're the scum of the earth, and so much and so forth. And so that was brilliant, because in some ways, he is what we would call a useful idiot for us, because by doing that, he set the stage for this whole week. So this whole week has been able to then run off that and jump off that. David didn't know that he was doing that, but he was giving us enormous amount of material that we could then unpack. And because of the fact that the debate was so popular, I think it's around 65,000 people have watched it. And because so many people are commenting on it, take a look at the comments at the bottom of David's site. Look at the ones on my site. I think it's up to 13,000 on my Fanders Film site. Take a look at the comments. The comments actually are engaging with the material of the debate, not so much with this back and forth cajoling and all the rest, but they were engaging with whether or not this really is a myth. Is this really a myth? Are we really conspiracy? That word is too big for me to try to put in my mouth. Are we that, or have we gone onto something? And I think for the first time, an awful lot of people, including an awful lot of Muslims, finally are getting and hearing about this difficulty concerning the evidence for the 7th century, the evidence for this man named Muhammad. Was there really a Muhammad in this 7th century? Or is the Muhammad that we know today, is he nothing more than a construct, a myth? In fact, this is the myth. The myth's over here from the 9th and 10th century. That's the myth. And we are proving we're not the myth makers. We're the myth breakers. That's what this is coming from Mel. Mel has coined it this way. And I think, Mel, you've done a good job.
Mythbusters. Mythbusters, actually.
Even better. That's right. Instead of Ghostbusters, we are the Mythbusters. So here we have the Mythbusters, and there's a group of us. You're looking at probably the main player right there, and that's Mel. Mel from Sneakers Corner. Listen, folks, go to his site. He's coming up with videos almost once a week or twice a week?
Yeah, once to twice a week, yeah.
You're coming up with new material, and this is stuff that you have looked at for years. But it's not just you. Explain who is on your team. Give us a background, because I don't think people know much about you guys.
Yeah. So we have Murad from the Middle East. He is very interested in looking behind the stories and trying to find out the historical situation. We have a guy from India who we call Bala, who is an encyclopedia, who knows the Islamic tradition and has read hundreds of books on the whole area. And so he's a very useful guy in our group. And we also have a new member called Joe. Joe is a very scholarly guy. He's been studying the origins of Islam for the last 20 years. So it's quite a group. And then we have a number of associate members who are kind of coming in for guest videos here and there. And we have a guy who's a member of the Inari group, which I'm sure you're aware of, Jay, who is going to be appearing soon. His name is Odin Lafontaine.
From France.
from France. He was mentored by Edward Gallet, who's a phenomenal scholar. So there's really fantastic ideas coming down the line. Really excited. This is a really hot
wouldn't you say
time.
that these guys that you, and right now they are all guys at the moment. There are women who are in the backgrounds, but the ones who are out in the forefront at the moment tend to be guys. We would like to get some more girls, but you found them all basically from comments from people responding to your videos and my videos, where we have put it out there. And this is where YouTube has done us a favor. The comments section, and we ask all of you, comment in those comments, because we do read the comments and we take them seriously if they are done seriously. If you're just joking or trolling, of course, we don't read them. But if they are serious engagement with material that we're working on, we will take you seriously and we will engage with you. And also what we're finding an enormous amount of people like Odin. I mean, he was sitting there. We never knew he existed until I got the coins going back in January. Suddenly I saw all these emails coming in from Odin Lafontaine there in France, who has been working on these coins for 15 to 20 years himself. He's way ahead of us. Yeah. And that's where we're kind of bringing together. So we are the myth busters, is what you call us.
Yeah, I do want to mention a woman called Faye, who doesn't want her identity kind of exposed or anything, but she's also done some research for us, and I forgot to mention her. And there's something really exciting. There's a revolutionary discovery that we've made through her work recently. It's literally going to be the first ever to hear it. Yeah, that'll come along in about a week or two's time. So yeah, so sorry to forget her.
And then there's one other, and he's the one that's been doing a lot of the research for me, and his is Dr. Pat Andrews. So he is one that has, wait till you find out what he's found out about the black stone. We're going to yet to introduce that. We have pretty much know where the black stone comes from and why it's so important and why it's still in the Kaaba today. That's yet to be done. So here we are. Not all these, in fact, almost all of these names that we have given cannot go into public. They dare not show their face in public because they are in areas, they're living in situations where either they could be killed or their family could be killed. And so to protect themselves, this is the problem. This kind of research, where you start to confront not the branches, as Mel has been saying, we're not looking and trying to mock Muhammad or do things like that, which just kind of eat away at the branches. We're going to the real front. We're going to the trunk. We're going to the real foundation. We're going to the roots of Islam. We're going to the very beginning of Islam. And when you start to do that, you are going to be targeted. And so, Mel, you've been targeted. I've been targeted. All those who are mocking Muhammad, like David and Sam and Hatun and the others who are working on that, they have been targeted. Colin has been targeted from Islam Critiqued. So Tony Costa from Canada, he has been targeted. We are willing to put our faces in public, but a lot of people are not. Christian Prince, for instance, will never put his face on public. You don't even know where he lives or where he comes from. You've never seen him. And that's to protect his life and to protect his family. And that is a real reality that we have to live with. Nonetheless, those of us who are putting in face in public, especially Mel, and this is why I want to thank you, Mel, for all your courage and for all the time that you've spent working on this, and you're willing to put your face in public and put your name out there. We're the ones who then communicated for the rest of you, and we are seen as communicators. Nonetheless, there's a growing number of us, and we want more of you to come on board. And this is one thing we're going to do, is we're going to take these supposedly myths that we have created, that David has called these myths, and we're going to say, let's see who has the myth here. Let's see who are the realists. David called himself the realist. We're now showing, by the end of that debate, it looked like David was the myth maker and we are the realists, because we're dealing with evidence on the ground. At the end of that debate, after I had asked him over and over and over, can you show me one piece of evidence for Muhammad from the 7th century? He could not come up with one. And we could come up with a whole treasure trove of reference after reference showing that Muhammad never existed. But there was a Muhammad there. There was a Muhammad there. And we are introducing that. Now, today, you're going to do something different, Mel. What is it you're going to do today?
Yeah, I'm going to look at the story of the Hadiths and how they came about. Let me just see if we can get it here.
So you're going to look at everything that David and Hatun and others are dependent on, and you're going to show exactly how they came about and really how they are the myth.
Absolutely.
Okay,
so
this is going to be fun.
This is a question that I get asked all the time. Can you please explain why the Hadiths were created? Was it just conspiracy and so on? So it's actually a complex answer, and it's not something I can just simply write a short little answer and there you have it. It's actually very complex, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Let me just something wrong here. Okay, so just quote from David Wood from last week. He said, "I would like to thank Dr. J. Smith for giving me this opportunity to debunk one of the most astounding pseudo-scholarly conspiracy theories the world has ever seen." And as you can see, he thought we were tin hats. But by the end of this, I think you'll see that we are actually on the side of reality here and not conspiracists. Okay, so what I would suggest is we are restorationists, not revisionists. On the contrary, we are not myth makers, but myth busters. We are not revising history as often charged, but restoring history. We are about fact checking the Islamic tradition. We have found little evidence to support it, and we have found a lot of factual evidence that contradicts that tradition. You can debunk myths and false ideas, but you can't debunk facts and evidence. And that's my position. I'm sure it is yours, Jay, as well. So I'd like to start really with a quote from Jonathan Swift from 1710. I think this is kind of a key idea here. "Besides, as the vilest writer has his readers, so the greatest liar has his believers. And it often happens that if a lie be believed only for an hour, it has done its work, and there's no farther occasion for it. Falsehood flies, and the truth comes limping after it, so that when men come to be undeceived, it is too late, the jest is over, and the tale has had its effect." So essentially, we are the ones limping or perhaps sneaking behind, trying to undo the damage that previous lies have done in the world, the damage that lies have done in the world. Now, just to illustrate the point, I'm going to take an example of a modern day myth. It's the idea that people thought the world was flat when Columbus sailed across the Atlantic. And I remember being told this as a fact when I was in primary school. The myth was a favorite in the 19th and 20th centuries, repeated by secularists as proof that Christians were backward and secularists were progressive. It even made its way in children's encyclopedia and school books. However, it started off as a Protestant anti-Catholic trope in the 7th century, a very marginal one, it should be said. But according to Stephen Jay Gould, there never was a period of flat earth darkness among scholars, regardless of how the public at large may have conceptualized our planet both then and now. Greek knowledge of sphericity never faded, and all major medieval scholars accepted the Earth's roundness as an established fact of cosmology. So the myth grew into a perceived fact. How did it happen? In 1828, Washington Irving's novel, A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, was published and mistaken by many for a scholarly work. This became very popular. Then, to make things worse, inaccurate histories such as John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, 1874, and Andrew Dickinson's White's A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, 1896, added credibility to the claim. Atheists and agnostics championed the conflict thesis for their own purposes, but historical research gradually demonstrated that Draper and White had propagated more fantasy than fact in their efforts to prove that science and religion are locked in eternal conflict. And I would suggest that what we're trying to do is exactly what those historical researchers did to overturn that misconception about the people in the Middle Ages. The point is that far from creating conspiracies, we are simply doing the mundane work of fact-checking and overturning established myths contained in the Islamic tradition. Knowing what we now know, it appears to me that accepting the Islamic tradition hook, line, and sinker, as Dr. David Wood does, is an astonishing act of credulity. All scholars, including David, should do due diligence by checking out their sources and by seeking corroborating evidence to make sure it all stacks up. Scholars before us raised some red flags about this tradition. I'm going to mention some of the red flags for now that they raised in the past, and later I'm going to raise some other red flags myself, about 11 of them in fact. So here's what other scholars have said before me. So Wansborough postulated that the Hadith were fabricated in order to give the Arabian Empire a distinctive religion so as to foster its stability and unity. The Sunnah helped to make Islam appear more Mohammedan and not just a Judeo-Christian offshoot. Lulin believes that the Quran reflects the theology of a non-Trinitarian Christian sect that left traces on Islamic theology, notably in its picture of Christ and its uncompromising Unitarianism. Kitani concluded that we can find almost nothing true on Muhammad in the traditions. We can discount as apocryphal all the tradition material that we possess. Henri Lamins backed up Gulzar's finding that the great majority of traditions from the Prophet are documents not of the time to which they claim to belong, but of the successive stages of development of doctrines during the first centuries of Islam. Lamins noted the artificial character and absence of critical sense in the compilation of the earliest biographies of the Prophet of Islam, although he warned that there can be no question of rejecting the whole en bloc. Hadith creation was not a conspiracy, but the result of many factors, both decentralized and centralized. There is no simplistic answer to how Hadiths came about. It is the result of many factors, and it was a slow evolution over a lengthy period of time. So I'm going to go through 11 of the red flags that I consider are important when we look at the Hadith. These should give everyone pause, and they should lead to maybe a reconsideration of the veracity of the Hadiths. So number one, some Hadiths came about to artificially Islamize laws by redacting stories to the 7th century. So to give you a sense of that, this is taken from Robert Spencer's book. Schacht went beyond even Gulzar's arguments, concluding, for instance, that a great many traditions in the classical and other collections were put into circulation only after Shafi's time. The first considerable body of legal traditions from the Prophet originated towards the middle of the 2nd century, and the evidence of legal traditions carries us back to about the year 100 AH only. That is to the first decade of the 8th century, not any closer to the time Muhammad is supposed to have lived.
Just say something
Robert,
about that. Go back to that.
Yeah.
This is something I remember coming out when I was studying in the 1920s, the 1990s. Hutting brought this up very clearly. He says, notice that all the isnad that the Muslims are always using, they always use the isnad to give support for one tradition over another tradition. They say, see, this tradition goes all the way back to the Prophet's life. And Hutting says, quoting from Goldziher and also from Schacht, who wrote in the 1950s, he said, notice that these isnads were only created back to the Prophet's time after Shafi brought this up as a problem. Shafi brought this up as a problem in 820. That's the 9th century. That's about the time Hisham is writing his biography. And he's saying that these have to go all the way back to the Prophet in order to be authoritative. How do you suddenly do oral tradition in the 9th century that goes all the way back to the Prophet unless you're fabricating them? And so he said, these are all fabrications. Every one of them is fabrications. And the only reason that they went all the way back to the Prophet is because they needed to in order to get their authority. So they only took those which they wanted to be authoritative, and they made sure that their lineage goes all the way back to the Prophet. Although not one of those names had anything written down for you to know whether or not that person ever said what they said. And that was, to me, was when the penny dropped for me in the 1990s when I heard that. And I said, why is it Muslims aren't telling us this? Why is it we haven't heard this before? So everything we know in Al-Bukhari is nothing more than traditions that were created post-820, post-9th century, 200 years after Muhammad. Okay, just to bring that in there, because that is explosive, what you're bringing up here.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge red flag, and it should make people question what is actually going on. And it is definitely worth Muslims' time to inquire and find out what exactly happened. So another quote here from Robert Hoyland. The laws that were in place in the Middle East the day before the Arab conquest were still in use the day after. And this pre-existing corpus of laws, a mixture of ancient Middle Eastern and Roman law, remained current in the Umayyad period, supplemented by ad hoc emendations made by caliphs and their agents. Now, what's the problem with these laws is that they don't come from Muhammad. These are just secular laws by and large. So obviously they wanted to Islamize these laws, and they needed some way of proving that they had come from the time of Muhammad. So creating hadiths were a great way of doing that.
May I just jump in there at this time?
Yeah.
Patricia Crona, go back to that. Patricia Crona actually introduces this in a paper she wrote about Islamic law and Roman law. And if you read that paper, she says this very thing. She says, isn't it interesting that when you look at these laws that we now call Sharia law, or these laws of fiqh, the Hanbali, Hanafi, Maliki, and Shafi schools, when you look at them, look how similar they are to Roman laws, to Byzantine Roman laws. And she says, should be nothing, this should not surprise us when you look and ask if there had been a corpus of religious thought in the Hijaz, in a place called Mecca and Medina, that central part of Arabia, in the 7th century. How is it you can get such sophisticated laws? How is it you can get laws that have to do with not only with social systems, but almost everything about the Islamic law is based on urban environment, an urban social fabric, an urban working structure as far as city is concerned. There are no urban structures in the Hijaz. Mecca and Medina are just little hamlets. There is not even a place called Mecca. Medina and Taif, these are nothing more than oases. So how could this sophisticated law have come about that early, that far south? Unless, of course, this is a much later law that is borrowed at a much later time from much north, which are all urban centers. Like places like Petra would have been an urban center, like as you're coming up with Hira and Kufa and Basra and Baghdad, and also now Damascus. Those would have been urban centers that would have had these kind of laws already in places. Then they only just took those laws and incorporated them into Islamic law, put an Islamic stamp on them, and then they redacted it back to the time of Muhammad in a nomadic environment, which had made no sense. She says this makes no sense in a nomadic environment, live in a place called Hijaz in Central Arabia in the 7th century. In the 9th century, yes, but not in the 7th century, which supports all the more reason while this is nothing more than borrowing. Like that's what Islam does. It borrows whatever around it, and then it Islamicizes it, puts a stamp on it, but it puts a stamp on it in the 9th and 10th century, and then redacts it back to the 7th century and said this all happened in a 22-year period from the time of 610 to 632. Hogwash. Nothing of the sort. It could not have happened that early and not that far south. Again, notice, we're saying this happened later and north, up to the north and later. There's the same paradigm that we have been using in all of our talks. Have you noticed that?
Yeah. I think it was Steve Bannon who once said there are no conspiracies, but there are also no coincidences. And I would suggest that the easy explanation here is that they simply borrowed these laws. So starting in the early 8th century, though, an emerging body of Muslim scholars began working through this ancient corpus and accepted, rejected, or modified its rulings, giving those they endorsed a done or said by Muhammad stamp, which lent old practices the appearance of being new Islamic ones from Arabia. For example, 2 6th century documents on papyrus from Petra and Nassana in Byzantine Arabia record the division of an inheritance by the drawing of lots, as opposed to applying a set of preordained rules. If we turn to collections of Muhammad's sayings, we find it written there that Muhammad was once approached by 2 men who disagreed about an inheritance, and he told them to cast lots and to accept whatever result this yielded. Sounds very much like a coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, the point being made here is not that Islam borrowed from or was influenced by ancient Middle Eastern and Roman law, but that this corpus of law remained current after the Arab conquests and was taken over and reworked by Muslim scholars. Now, hadiths mimic also the Jewish judicial system. So this is another layer to this. Islamic law, or Sharia, came to be a defining feature of Islamic civilization. Its structural similarity with Judaism betrays its origins in early Abbasid Iraq, where Muslim lawyers enjoyed close and sustained contact with the region's large and prosperous Jewish community. Jurisprudential theory, which stressed 4 principal sources, scripture, practice, analogy, and consensus, could be Roman, Judaic, or derived more broadly from the late antique Middle East. But where did the raw material for the individual laws come from? To give the appearance of having all originated in Muhammad's Arabia, since they are traced back via a chain of transmitters to Muhammad himself. Even here, we can see that Robert Hoyland sees an Iraqi connection in all of this.
Isn't it fascinating, though? This is exactly what you would expect. When you stop and think, so much of the Quran is borrowed from other sources. Why are we surprised if much of Islam is borrowed from other sources? Because when you stop, like we said earlier, and Patricia Crone said this very succinctly, how can you have a nomadic environment create such a sophisticated environment with all these laws and institutions that, lo and behold, here they're the same laws and institutions that come from the surrounding countries, but much further north, from these Jewish and much more urban structures? That would make no sense in a rural environment. And so they've just taken these, they borrowed it because that's what they came in contact with, that's what they were used to themselves, and all they did was redact it back to the 7th century. But nowhere in the world could this have happened in a 20-year period. From almost nothing to suddenly sophistication in 20 years. Why hasn't anybody thought this through?
Yeah, it takes decades, if not centuries, before you develop a legal system. But it gets better, Jay, because I'm going to show you evidence that they not only borrowed the laws from the Jews, they borrowed the ideas from the Jews, and they borrowed even the terminology that they used in these legal judgments. So it's going to get really interesting. Okay, so this is actually from Lloyd de Jong, who's a South African scholar. He spent the last 13 years researching Sharia, and he found some interesting details, and he was recently on my channel, and I've just borrowed this from his presentation. So if we compare the Talmud with Sharia, we can see a clear borrowing from the Jewish legal system. I'm just going to point out a few similarities. So if we think about the word that's used here in Hebrew, you have Koreh. In the Islamic world, we have Qara'a, to proclaim. We have this law being interpreted and expanded upon in the Talmud, in the Jewish side, and it's done in Sharia on the right-hand side. And what's very interesting, the oral tradition, the Mishnah, is referred to in Hebrew as Soneh, and in Arabic, Sunnah. And they both have 6 books, which is quite remarkable. The stories that are used in the Jewish side are referred to as Hidus or Hadas. And you change the S to TH and you have Hadith. So there's a clear borrowing. The legal doctrine.
Can I just jump in there? I think the comeback on this is, well, that would make sense since both languages come from the same root. So both your Jewish Hebrew or Aramaic would have the same root as your Arabic. So it would stand to reason that they use the same words.
He was under the impression that they're so particular and that there are other options available, that this would suggest that there's a more direct implication. I think when you see the location in the next slide, where the Sharia system was set up and its location next to Jewish academies, I think it'll become clear that it's more than just a linguistic connection based on the similarities of the languages.
Okay.
But, so you have halakha is the legal doctrine. Now notice here, they didn't use halakha for the word for legal doctrine. It's fiqh, but they actually did call the place where it happened the halakha. So there is some sort of connection there. So if we look at the next slide, see Iraq there, Kufa in the south with 2 academies, 2 more only 87 miles away. And let me just get this out of my way here. So this is taken from Schacht. Schacht says material influences causing changes in the doctrines of other Islamic law schools continue to proceed almost exclusively from the law schools of Iraq. Schacht concluded with Goldziher that Mohammedan jurisprudence originated in Iraq. The discovery that Islamic...
Just so people understand what's happening here, that map you're showing, you're showing the Star of David. Those would be Jewish seminaries. The one with the star in the moon would be a Islamic seminary. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, those are the Star and David represent the Jewish academies, and yes, the moon and star, it represents the Islamic one in Kufa. So you
So
can see how
this would be
close they are.
why there is this cross-pollination. This is why, because they were in contact with each other. Their debates were happening almost probably on a daily, weekly basis. Can you then understand why so many of, even in the Quran, so many of the debates are really against Jews and Christians? Their seminaries, as you're saying, their well, not madrasas are right next door to each other.
Academies, yeah.
It would then
Yeah.
stand to reason that they would have so much borrowing from it.
Yeah. So it goes on to say the discovery that Islamic jurisprudence emerged on the banks of the Euphrates and not on the sands of Arabia, home of the Prophet and birthplace of Islam, clearly invites further investigation. So once again, it's a red flag. It should draw people's attention. And it goes on to say the site of the most important early Islamic law school, the Hanifa school at Kufa, was close to the Jewish academies of Sura and Pompadita, where scholars studied the Talmud throughout the formative period of Islamic law. There would have been no problem of communication. The early Iraqi jurists, including local converts to Islam, both Jews and others, who spoke the Eastern Talmudic Aramaic, which remained the lingua franca of Iraq for centuries after the Arab conquest. So not only are they in close proximity, but they could speak the same language, which was a form of Aramaic. So it's quite a strong case.
Now, stop and think this through. Take that one step further, Mel. Look at where the Gida'ats are all formed. Of the 30 Gida'ats that became official by the 15th century, by 1429, 22 of them are all in this area and a little and in Damascus, but they're all in this area that you're looking at. Even the Gida'ats, the Quran, the different derivations are all coming from this area. No wonder they had differences. No wonder they had difference of opinions, because they were being influenced by, I would guess, these Jews and these Christians they had contact with.
Absolutely. So it all makes sense, really. Now, this did not set the law in stone. New sayings or deeds were added, and judges used analytical reasoning to develop new rulings or fatwas by analogy with existing rulings. But with the emergence of these collections, one could speak of a tangibly Islamic way of doing things. So they copied the Jewish method of using stories as a way to create new laws based on the old laws. Okay, so we move on to second red flag. The biography of Muhammad came surprisingly late for such an important figure. This is a point that you've brought up on many occasions, but it's worth noting. The Sirah, the earliest biography of Muhammad, was written by Ibn Ishaq, 1773, which we obviously don't have. We have Ibn Hisham's, but who wrote in the latter part of the 8th century, at least 125 years after the death of his protagonist, in a setting in which legendary material about Muhammad was proliferating. This is taken from Robert Spencer's book. And note, he was ordered to write it by the Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. He was also paid for it. He was known as a forger by Muslim scholars. Malik ibn Anas called him Dajjal min Dajjajila, the quack of many quacks. And al-Bukhari didn't trust him. So this is not the sort of person you want to be writing a biography, particularly one that you could rely on. What wasn't considered embarrassing, I should say, in the 8th century became considered embarrassing in the 9th century when Ibn Hisham edited the Sirah. Ibn Hisham edited out what he found embarrassing, but embarrassing stories can stem from either false or true accounts. And this is something that David Wood hasn't really considered. So if you look at these two diagrams here, first one could be a false story, and that false story may have a combination of embarrassing and non-embarrassing details. Likewise, you could have a story which is fundamentally true. Similarly, it could have embarrassing and non-embarrassing stories or details to the story. So the fact that there are embarrassing details or not embarrassing details does not tell us anything really about whether the story is true or not. We have all heard embarrassing and untrue rumors are going around about ourselves. In fact, I'm sure I can definitely vouch for that. This goes to show that the fact that they are embarrassing aren't proof of their veracity. The idea that there is no smoke without fire doesn't always hold true. The retention of these hadiths in folklore is only proof of the readiness of people to believe gossip, especially before the cult of personality around Muhammad had been fully crystallized. So a lot of these stories which developed in the early part of the 8th century, for example, some of which contain embarrassing details, you have to imagine that people were probably comfortable with a lot of the details and didn't consider them embarrassing. But Muhammad hadn't yet risen to a full cult figure, so people were more forgiving of these details. It was only centuries later that people were fully on board with the idea of him being so perfect and such a great guy. But in the early days, he was just an ordinary human being. And also the issue is that credibility is entirely subjective. What is considered embarrassing is both subjective and culturally open to change. Therefore, embarrassing hadiths offer no objective assurance of their veracity. I don't know if you want to jump in on that, Jay?
Yeah, I think this is fascinating because what you're saying, is, if this is so, that much of what we see as fallacious or false, in the beginning, they were not false. The same thing could be said of the Quran as well. Because when you look at the Quran, you will see that one of the things that David and us have always said, take a look at what the earliest compilers of the Quran, or those who were the people like the compilers of the Hadith, look what they say about the Quran. Look what Al-Bukhari and them say. They admit that there's all kinds of there are all kinds of verses that were changed, manipulated. There were verses that were eaten by sheep. There were verses that were destroyed or accreted and deleted. We've gone through this list many times, and we're always aghast. Why aren't modern scholars looking at it? Well, this idea of immutability of the Quran did not really get introduced till 1056 by Ibn Hazm. That's 11th century. And the same thing token would be about this Muhammad. This Muhammad didn't really, this idea that he was the greatest of all, or the model or the paradigm for all of mankind, really did not get introduced until the late 9th century, or leading into the 10th century, about a little bit earlier than the Quran itself. So that would stand to reason that the earlier references about him showed all his warts and all his that showed all his fallacies. He was just a man like you and me. He then got elevated, and I would suggest he got elevated possibly because of these debates and discussions they were having with the Christians. Jesus was so perfect, they needed someone who could be equivalent. And because of these discussions they were having in Kufa that you're talking about, when Jesus had no errors, had no faults, and he was the best of the best, the creme de la creme, and the model for all mankind, they can't find it. And even today, we still can't find any problems with him. Can you see they needed to have a prophet that was equal or better? So can you not understand, while those then, anything that was, that Ibn Ishaq had come up with, Ibn Hisham eradicated, destroyed, or anything that were in these 600,000 traditions that were given to Al-Bukhari in 870, he whittled them down to 7,397. Can we understand? Now, why did he throw out 98%? Because those did not fit the narrative of the super guy, the big guy, the one that's bigger than Jesus. Had to be bigger, had to be the seal of the prophet, had to be the better than all the other prophets that had come before, so they whittled them down. Now, David is correct. There's still an awful lot of embarrassing stories, but you notice those stories really are only a handful. When they had the debate in 2012, he could only come up with 2, really, they're really embarrassing. Of the 10 he put forward, pretty much Robert Spencer only said really 2 are embarrassing, and that's the story of Zainab and the story of the satanic verses. Other than that, there's nothing embarrassing about the rest. Really, there's not much there. And if you spend all your time and energies focusing on those 2 and kind of disregarding, what about the other wealth of material, 9 volumes that actually aggrandize him and show him quite a stupendous of a character? And that's why Muslims only look at the 99%, and they don't look at that small 2% that David Wood likes to look at, or we like to look at, that we have a tendency to zero in on.
Yeah, I think the fact that Muslims hadn't left Islam en masse because of the embarrassing stories suggests that they didn't find them embarrassing. Full stop.
Even today,
that kind of undermines the argument.
Even today, yeah. No, good stuff. Thank you.
Okay, so number 3, third red flag. There are contemporary witnesses to widespread fabrication of hadiths. So this is not speculation. We have actually eyewitness accounts, and this is from Robert Hoyland. So they're quite amusing, actually. The first one says, I spent a year sitting with Umar the first's son, Abdallah, said one legal scholar, and I did not hear him transmit anything from the Prophet. We learn from another scholar writing around 740 who observes, I never heard Jabir ibn Zayd say, the Prophet said, blah, 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 and yet the young men around here are saying it 20 times an hour. So clearly there's people in the 8th century who are they're gobsmacked with all of these stories going around, and they're thinking, where are they getting this material from? Because we should know, and we haven't heard any of this stuff. So very interesting.
Yeah.
Number 4. There's also another case here, which is vested interest and the idea of social mobility, as I will point out now. We see a slavery link. So if you look at so many of the sources for the Hadiths, there's a strong slavery link. They're either a captive, son of a captive, and when we talk about captive here, we're talking about slave, or grandson of a captive. So why is it that so many of them who are producing these Hadiths are either slaves or ex-slaves or descendants of slaves? So my suggestion is being a scholar in stories was a way out of slavery or a convenient path to social advancement. Additionally, scholarship was a way for newcomers and the lowborn to attain respect and status. And here's a quote, if it were not for our expertise in the sayings of Muhammad, observed one non-Arab, emphasis on non-Arab, religious authority, we would be on a par with greengrocers. So clearly there's a great incentive to be a so-called expert in these stories, and who's to stop them from making up stories? And the more stories you had, the higher up the social ladder you went. So this was a path to high social status at a time when Muhammad was considered a big cult figure. So that's a strong incentive to create stories if you wanted to rise up the ladder. So red flag number 5. Hadith writers are collectors and the proximity to location of events or lack thereof. So this should be a red flag. The fact, when you look at where the Hadith writers are from, not one single Hadith writer was from Arabia, where you'd expect them to be from. So let's have a look there. As you can see, none of them are from Arabia. That should raise a red flag there straight away.
I brought this up I showed a map, much like you're showing right here, and I looked at all the kilometers away from Mecca, and you're talking about thousands of kilometers away. And what's interesting, you can see they come from Uzbekistan, that's Bukhara is in Uzbekistan. They come from Tajikistan, or they also come from Tabaristan, which is in what today is Iran. And so you're talking about thousands of kilometers away, but they did their work in Baghdad, again, which is kilometers away from Mecca. No one did anything down in Mecca, which you don't have here, but it's right where the Red Sea is, just to the right of the Red Sea. That area would be where according to the traditions, they did all the work. Not one of them did their work down there. Not one of them even lived there. Not one of them even knew of a place called Mecca. Mecca did not exist that early. No. So that destroys any notion that any of this could have come that far south. It all comes from the north. Those stars those stars exactly make your point.
Yeah, and actually the only place that if you were to pick up any verifiable material, it would be a local tradition. And if they were writing it in Baghdad, the only way it's possible to get a glimpse of what happened, it must mean that Islam started there and not elsewhere. And obviously, even with that, they have changed it dramatically from what it was originally. Now, red flag number 6, coins contradict the chronology supposed by the Hadiths. And I know this is an area that you've done a lot of work on. But look at the use of images here. When Abd al-Malik sought to unify the currency of his realm, he initially followed the standard custom of placing his image as the ruler on the new coins, but a couple of years later, he withdrew this type of minted coins with no images on them, bearing only words.
Now,
No.
just to jump into that.
Do you want me to come back there?
That last slide. Look at that image there. That image is not just any image. It's actually of him with a sword and it is in contradistinction to Justinian II going to war with him, because the year before that, he introduced another coin that did have the Byzantine cross missing the cross piece. So it was a mockery of the Byzantine cross on the backside. On the front side, he introduces the Shahada, La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. Now, as you and I know from what Murad has really introduced to us, this idea of Muhammad, Rasulullah, is the praised one, is the prophet of God. It looks like he was referring to himself at that time. And this was the coins that he gave to Justinian II in homage, because he was paying homage at this time. Justinian II went to war with him because of that. He was so angered because of that he went to war, and he introduces this coin that you see there. Take a look at that coin. There's the image. Hold on a minute. We thought imagery was anathema in Islam. Nobody could have image because that's idolatry. What's it doing in 693? This coin you see up there on the left was introduced in 693. That's a statement of war. That's why he's holding his sword at an angle. That would be a statement of war against Justinian II. There's the political reason. You've got to look at the politics to understand the coins. There is nothing at all, and that I can see here that would suggest, well, in this case, that this is the anything to do with Islam of the 9th century. First of all, Islam of the 9th century would not have images. Secondly, they would not, in the same token, they would not be having a political problem with they would have a political problem, but they would not, this is not a theological problem, this is a political problem. Nothing to do with theology, because it's pointing to him, Malik, as the emissary of God, as the praised one of God. And that's why he then introduces the coin on the right, that you see on the right, which is in 696. 696, he then takes the image off, and from that time on, Mel, there are no images. So this idea, this problem with iconoclasm was introduced by Abdul Malik in 696, not by Muhammad in 632 or earlier. Can you see? We're talking a good 60 years too late. That's too late for the Islamic traditions to be correct.
I want to throw something into the mix. This is something Joe told me very recently. In Jewish tradition, I think it's in the Mishnah or possibly the Talmud, the Jewish idea of Jesus is that the person they think is Jesus was actually a nephew of Jesus, who was the son of Mary Magdalene and Joses. Now, this is probably a legend, okay? But for what it's worth, it was believed by Jews for centuries. And in this story, this Jesus, Yeshua, was stoned to death and then hung on a pillar. He wasn't crucified. And look what you see on the coin on the left. It seems to me, and this is Joe's opinion as well, that perhaps what Abdul al-Malik is doing is actually siding with the Jewish idea of Jesus, not the Christian idea. So this, to me, is, if it's true, this is very revolutionary, and it might explain quite a lot.
Again, and this is what was one reason. This would be another reason why Abdul Malik, when he introduces that, this is not where he introduces it. He introduces on the coin earlier than this, a year earlier, which would be the mockery, because there's the mockery. That would mean the pillar that the nephew of Jesus was hung on, siding with the Jews against Byzantine Christianity. Now stop and think, Mel. Why would he be siding with the Jews against Byzantine Christianity? Who were the superpower of the day that he was in conflict with? Not the Jews,
obviously.
the Byzantines. Why then would you, at the same year that he introduces this coin, and the previous year before this, he also builds the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, of all places? That has nothing to do with Judaism. It's sitting there right looking down onto the Church of the Sepulchre, which was the sanctuary for the Byzantine Christians. And that's why in your ambulatory, he then has all this mockery of Jesus. Chapters 4, verse 171 of the Quran, say not three, for God is one, and he has no son. That's mocking the Trinity. That's mocking Jesus' divinity and his sonship, which is at the whole root of Islam. Islam was created, you might even say, was begun as an institution by Abdul Malik with that intention in mind. But then when Muhammad is introduced on the coins, he's not referring to Jesus this time. He's referring to himself as the praised one. He is the praised one, in contradistinction to your Jesus.
Absolutely. Okay, I think you kind of made the point there, really. So the issue with all of this is the fact that in Muhammad's time, there was no iconoclastic era, but the Islamic tradition supposes it. But as we can see from the evidence of the coins, the iconoclastic era came around Abdul al-Malik's time, not earlier. So number 7.
Talking about 60 years later. So how is it that Muslims can claim that this happened at the time of Muhammad? What do you do with the coins? Remember, not just Abdul Malik. Look at Muawiyah's coins. He has images on all of his as well. They start with Khosrau, which is the great Sasanian king, but also he also has images of himself later on with a cross in his hand. So how could that iconoclasm be a problem? So there again, that completely shuts down the narrative there in the Islamic traditions from the 9th and 10th century.
Absolutely. I think it's rock solid, conclusive evidence that this is a later fiction, really, in the Islamic tradition. Okay, so number 7, the 7th red flag that I would like to raise is Hadith's attempt unsuccessfully to cover up the obviously fractious early period. One blot on this otherwise idyllic picture was the unseemly behavior of Muhammad's companions, who squabbled and fought one another, most obviously in the First Civil War. They were therefore given a makeover, sanctified by recourse to late antique heliographical techniques, and all came out as models of piety and beyond reproach, headed by the 4 rightly guided caliphs, which we have no evidence of: Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. That's straight from Robert Hoyland in God's Path. Essentially, what has happened is the Islamic tradition have photoshopped the early leaders. These hadiths about the first caliphs don't ring true. We're forced to reconcile the honeymoon stories with the reality of assassinations and Rida wars.
And isn't this what we always do with history? We want our best, we want our great heroes, in this case Muhammad, to be the best and the best, the creme de la creme, the seal of the seal. And obviously when we look at the real, what was happening on the ground, there was anything but.
Yeah. So a decentralized process that didn't need a conspiracy. So this is my suggestion, that it wasn't a conspiracy. There's a wide range of factors. Robert Hoyland says this process was carried out by a large number of religious authorities in different centers of the Arab Empire at a furious pace, and already by the mid-9th century, a number of collections of the sayings and deeds of Muhammad had been compiled. So the fact that it's happening all over the empire by large numbers of religious authorities, and even people are making up hadiths independently as well, would suggest that this was no conspiracy, but simply this was in everyone's interest, and it was very chaotic and contradictory and so on. So not a conspiracy, in other words. The religious scholars sought to protect their own status as the guardians of the law by closing the door to any other would-be legislators, in particular the rulers who had themselves legislated in the past or appointed others to do so for them. So this is another purpose behind the Hadith. The scholars achieved this by positing that only the first 4 caliphs had the power to legislate, making the period when they ruled, 632 to 660, into a golden age when Islam was perfected and its norms properly practiced and implemented. So essentially this was a religious power grab. So the idea behind creating these hadiths, which said that this was the golden era with the first 4 caliphs or 5 caliphs, this was essentially saying that only they could legislate, and so that stopped the caliphs having too much power. It basically moved the power from the caliphs onto the religious authorities of the day. So this is another reason behind the hadiths. Now, number 8, hadiths were used to support opposing factions. And this is something that I heard you and Robert talking about in a recent live stream, which Jay from Soko Films.
It's actually going to be going up on, it will precede this video. It'll be on Vander Films as well.
Yeah. Hadiths were often created to attack the opposing side. The pioneering Hungarian scholar Goldsire took such investigations even further. He determined that the lateness of the Hadith collections relative to the time Muhammad was supposed to have lived, together with the widespread Muslim tendency to forge stories about Muhammad that supported a political position or religious practice, made it virtually impossible to regard the Hadith, which fill many volumes, as historically reliable. And that, to me, is a killer statement there. You can't have 2 Hadiths saying opposite things and then to say that they are historically reliable. The Hadiths became political weapons in the hands of warring factions within the Islamic world, And as is always the case with weapons in wartime, they began to be manufactured wholesale. So here's an example of politically motivated character assassination. A Syrian source from 741 survives in Latin translation in a Spanish chronicle, and its entry for Yazid I runs as follows: most pleasant man, and deemed highly agreeable by all the people subject to his rule. He never, as is the wont of men, sought glory for himself because of his royal rank, but lived as a citizen along with all the common people. So if we were to put a number on that, that would be like he's got a 10 out of 10 in terms of this person's estimation. As it does say, though it does add that he achieved few or no victories, so maybe I'm being too generous, maybe 9 out of 10 there. This contrasts starkly with the extant Muslim histories, which portray him as a sinner in respect of his belly and his private parts, an arrogant, drunken sot, motivated by defiance of God, lack of faith in his religion, and hostility towards his messenger.
Who is this referring to? Sorry?
This is Yazid I.
Okay, so he is this is the Caliph Yazid I.
Yeah, so there's, as you can see, there's two very contradictory reports.
Okay.
Now, it's not possible.
Yazid I from 686-83, he's a Sufyani family of the Umayyad Caliphate, which are despised by the later, not only by the Marwanids, but especially despised by the Abbasids. So I'm sure, so this first one, you might say, is from that time period or close to that time period from within the Umayyad Caliphate. That's
definitely from the Umayyad side, definitely, yeah.
Whereas the yellow, the part that comes later that actually shows him as a real stinker, is actually from the Abbasid period.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a case in point right there.
Yeah, like this is, like if people find it hard to believe the idea that a tradition could be completely overturned by the Abbasids, well, here's your evidence right in front of you. It's clear that there was something up here. They've basically turned on the Umayyads. They're trying to ruin their whole record for their own purposes.
Would you not say then that it's this, in this case, this is from a hero to a zero? That's what we see going on in this, from heroes to zeros. They're eradicating, they're destroying anything that came before. They are the new power. They've warred with them for almost 100 years. They've been under their jurisdiction from 661 up until 750. So we're talking about 90 years. You can understand then why they hated them. And that's why now then they take over. The Umayyads, who had their headquarters in Damascus, they destroy that and bring their headquarters, their political capital, down to Baghdad. Therefore, it stands to reason that they would have destroyed anything that had gone ahead. If that's the case, we can see here from a political standpoint, why are we not surprised? They would also do everything they could in their power to then create their then new hero. From those are all heroes down to zeros. Where is their new hero? Muhammad becomes their new hero.
Absolutely, and this will also explain the reason why there's a big gap in the history, because they clearly destroyed everything that the Umayyads had written, or as much as they could. So there was no record. There was nothing from that time, and they had what do they say, a blank slate to work from. Now, so another example here, this is an anti-Ali one. Muawiyah is presented in a hadith as having told his lieutenant, do not tire of abusing and insulting Ali and calling for God's mercifulness for Uthman, defaming the companions of Ali, removing them and admitting to listen to them, praising in contrast the clan of Uthman, drawing them near to you, and listening to them. Accordingly, a hadith appeared in which Muhammad declared that Ali's father and Muhammad's guardian, Abu Talib, was burning in hell. Perhaps my intercession will be of use to him at that day of resurrection, so that he may be transferred into a pool of fire which reaches only up to the ankles, but which is still hot enough to burn his brain. So that's an anti-Ali hadith. In another hadith that came to be loved of the Shiites, Muhammad declares, so know then that whose master I am, their master is Ali's also. In another pro-Ali hadith, Muhammad exclaims to one of his companions, O Anas, is there anyone amongst the Ansar who is better than or preferable to Ali? So you can see that these hadiths are being created on spec to support each other's faction, whether it be the Sunni side or the Shia side. Did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that people have brought up, and many people have come up and questioned me. If this is all fictitious, if this is nothing more than a redaction of the Abbasids against everything previous. Where does the Sunni Shia divide come in? Because that seems to suggest that this Sunni Shiite is very rampant today, and it's been so for, we have thought, for 1400 years. From what you're showing me here, this actually comes about not 1400 years ago. This comes out 1300 years ago. And would it not be for the same reason that we just saw earlier, whereas the scholars did not want to have the caliphs to have hegemony, the scholars wanted themselves to have hegemony. In the same token, they would not want the progeny of Muhammad to have hegemony or any power. They wanted to retain that power. That's why you then have this divide between those who thought that the descendants of Muhammad should be in power versus the ulema, the scholars, the religious scholars who did not want the progeny of Muhammad to be in power. And that's why they would then create their idea of the Sunnah. What is the Sunnah? Is the example of the Prophet, but not the progeny of the Prophet. Ali is the progeny of the Prophet. So you can see this is a political, this is really a political battle that's going on during the Abbasid period. It's a very real battle, but it seems to be being introduced or is starting here in the 9th century or the late 8th century, early 9th century, not something that was going on in the 7th century.
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting here? If you look at it, Ali seems to be opposed to the Ansar. Can you see that? Is there anyone amongst the Ansar who's better than or preferable to Ali? Now, we know from some 7th century sources that Ali was the emir of Hira. He never became a caliph, but he was emir for about 2 years. But just looking at that there, it would suggest that the Ansar would come from the west if Ali was from the east, because that was where the main division was. It came from the time of the Lakhmids, which were in the east, and the Ghassanids in the west. So the Ansar would likely, just even from this evidence that we have here, be from the Ghassanid side, Ali along the Lakhmid side. But look at this map that I'm going to show you, which I got from Odin. This is a 1927 map. It was created by René Dussault and reproduced in Gallet's article, Messiah and His Prophet. And look, there's a location there in Ghassanid country, Ansariya. It's a location which is simply on the western side of the place that we're talking about. So this is in Ghassanid country. But notice that there is a location named after the Ansar there, which is interesting. Now, Joe and I will be talking about the meaning of that word. Well, actually, Odin and I will be talking about the meaning of that word, which is actually a group called the Judeo-Nazarenes, is connected with them. So the Ansar, which means helpers, appear to be a Judeo-Nazarene group. But notice the key thing here is they're not way down in the Hijaz. They're, again, way up north. The wrong place in terms of the Islamic tradition.
And fascinating, because what you're bringing up, Mel, you're doing this over and over again. Thank you for doing this. And just to remind the people who are watching, you're showing that in every case, whether it is a discussion, a political discussion, or a religious discussion, or in this case, a discussion of secession and who has political power, this does not make sense in the Hijaz, because there was none of these groups down there to have made any sense for this to have been that early. It all makes sense in the north. So even your case with the Ansar, that's up in the north as well, way over on the coast of the Mediterranean, just above Haifa, which is what present-day Israel, and just below Beirut. In the case
Christians,
go ahead.
Sorry to cut across you. The Christians in the Quran are referred to, is it Nasara?
Nasara, because of the Nazarene.
Yeah, look at here. Look at the location in the middle of the map. If you go to here, I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
So there's locations that are connected again with that as well. So this totally fits up here.
Okay, to be fair, this is something you're going to have to look at a little bit closer, because we have always been told that Nazara is not really a place, it is a people. They are the Nazarenes, because Jesus was a Nazarene from Nazareth. So that would be from the city of Nazareth. It may be that it could be this word here. Maybe this is the rendition of it. We don't know. But certainly that is what I've heard. Unpack it. That might be the next one you might want to look at.
Well, Odin's theory is that there is a sect that had the name Nasara in it, which they were a different sect from Christianity and Judaism. But we'll deal with that at a later time. It's take quite a length of time to unpack that. But that'll be something for the future. Now, number 9, some were forced to write hadiths. We have evidence that some of these hadith writers were actually forced to do so. So the early Islamic scholar Muhammad ibn Shihab Azuri, who died in 741, 60 years before the death of Malik ibn Anas, complained even in his day that the emirs forced people to write hadiths. Even the Caliph al-Mahdi was known as someone who fabricated hadiths. So this is from Robert Spencer again. So that's very damning. And it should be a red flag to people. If you're forced to write something, what's the likelihood of it being true? You know, if I was forced to make a confession, you know, maybe if I was tortured by I don't know, the CIA or someone to make a confession, is my confession valuable? Is it reliable? Of course not. So this should make us question, if people are being forced to write hadith, can we trust this? Can we take it as historical?
Yeah, good stuff.
Number 10, some hadiths are blatantly anachronistic. But opponents of the Umayyads had Muhammad disparage the Caliph al-Walid, as you can see, 705, 715. In the hadith, Muhammad confronts a man who has just named his newborn son al-Walid. You name your children by the names of our pharaohs. Verily, a man with the name al-Walid will come who will inflict great injury upon my community than ever did Pharaoh upon his people. Now, I ask you, Jay, which is more likely, that this is a prophecy or this is a self-serving contemporary reference to al-Walid from the time?
It sounds pretty natural that this is written after 715 and it was redacted back onto Muhammad.
Absolutely. And lastly, at least in terms of the red flags, some hadiths conveniently allow later Muslims to slip rulings into the Quran after they can no longer change the Quran. So here's the one. It's you mentioned it actually. It's the verse or the hadith about the sheep eating the Quran. So I'm just going to read this to you. The verse of stoning and of breastfeeding an adult 10 times was revealed, and the paper was with me under my pillow, according to Aisha. When the Messenger of Allah died, we were preoccupied with his death, and a tame sheep came in and ate it. These verses were abrogated in recitation, but not ruling. Now, what's interesting, the verse of stoning is there and the breastfeeding an adult 10 times. I consider the breastfeeding one there as a misdirection in this hadith. The main issue is the verse of stoning. Now, say if you were living in the 9th or 10th century and you want there to be a verse in the Quran which permits stoning for adultery so that you can follow the laws of Moses, unfortunately the Quran doesn't mention one. So what do? You say, well, there was one in the Quran originally, but it was eaten by a sheep. And what's interesting, and this kind of gives the game away, they say, you know, there's the issue, it was abrogated, but they put in this clause, these verses were abrogated in recitation, but not ruling. Do you see the point? So what they're doing is, they're basically saying, yeah, so stoning is still allowed. The only abrogation was in recitation. So they're essentially saying, no, it really was part of the Quran, and so it's therefore backed by the Quran, when in fact it was never in the Quran.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's how they slipped it in.
And that would be chapter 24, verse 2.
Yep. So now I'm going to move on from that to a response to common objections. I'm going to look at the argument from embarrassment and the chain of narration. So the objection one is the argument from embarrassment. In normal circumstances, an argument from embarrassment might be used to establish if a story was reliable, but this doesn't take into account the process by which the hadiths were created and how they competed for acceptance. In Al-Bukhari, Zaid was Muhammad's adopted son, therefore making Muhammad's marriage to Zaid's wife highly embarrassing. Surely the argument from embarrassment would support this as historically reliable. I think this was one, Jay, that David brought up in the debate.
This is the one of the two that Robert Spencer said are the two best ones that he had. He said this back in 2012. Interestingly, in 2018, when he went on board and he was actually being interviewed by someone else, he said, the two that I would hold to are the argument, the Zaid and Zainab story, and also the Satanic verses. So he had already reduced from 8 down to 2, and then he brought up the same 8 again in my debate last week, thinking that maybe we hadn't watched that debate. But these are the two. This is the one that Robert Spencer handled so well. You're going to do the same thing here.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm afraid we're going to have to reduce it to 1. It's because St. John of Damascus, writing in the 730s, undercuts that argument, showing that Zaid was thought of as merely a friend of Muhammad. That's from the 730s. That would suggest that this story grew legs after the 730s, and the idea of him being a son-in-law came in later. So originally the story was just simply that he was a friend. Now it could be that St. John of Damascus got his facts wrong, but this was a very learned man, and it certainly would make me question at least, when did the story really begin, you know?
Well, Robert Spencer explains this. He said it looks like it was created from a friend. And this would make sense if he was nothing more than a friend. As far as John of Damascus died in 749, so this would be the Umayyad period. If he was nothing more than a friend during the Umayyad period, the Abbasids need a story to hang on this notion that nobody can come in the line of Muhammad. He cannot have any adopted son. So they put the problem of adoption in there. And then at the end of chapter 33 of the Quran, they then say, but Muhammad is the father of no one. So this eradicates any notion that somebody can come in the line of Muhammad. That would then be also another support for them against the Shiites, who want that progeny to come from the line of Muhammad. This eradicates any notion that anybody can be in the line of Muhammad by putting that story in there, which initially he was nothing more than a friend. He becomes an adopted son of Muhammad. He then is said, gets a revelation from God that nobody can be adopted from the Prophet himself. That then shuts down that any hope for the future of anybody claiming to be the lineage of Muhammad, and that shuts down the Shiites.
It's a power grab, essentially.
It's a power grab. This is a power grab. And this is what you do. How do you create your political legitimacy? You create it by putting it on a theological powerhouse, in this case, Muhammad. Muhammad creates it for you. And that's why once you can claim it and trace it back to Muhammad, then there's no more discussion after that.
So here's my explanation about the Hadiths and this whole idea of embarrassment. I call it the war of the Hadiths. Okay. With many Hadiths vying for acceptance, the raciest, most lurid of them rise to the top. It's just human nature. It's the reason why David Wood's videos are watched by thousands of people, because they're very entertaining and there's usually something quite embarrassing in them. Stories are adapted to make them more popular. The steamer they were, the more popular they became. The principle is the same for why tabloids sell more copies than serious broadsheet newspapers. Simply sex sells. The Sun newspaper, which is one that you find in the UK, might go with a headline like Celeb X in romp with Celeb Y. We've all seen those sort of headlines. The Hadiths recount stories of Muhammad's romps with 12 or 13 in one night. It's like straight out of these saucy newspapers. Therefore, in these circumstances, the argument from embarrassment offers no assurance of the Hadith's reliability. A dull Muhammad won't create the cult of personality that is needed for the empire's cohesion. The powers that be want Muhammad well known, and one way of making sure that the stories get out there is to sex them up a little bit and make them interesting so people share them. And I've developed this idea based on the idea of memes contained in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. So the idea of a meme is something that is it could be a story or a picture or an image that becomes very popular and is spread among the population. So, for example, if we take the example of a good tweet or a good picture that's connected with a tweet, if it becomes popular, it will be shared by lots of people. And usually, a bit of gossip will spread much quicker than a boring, dull story. So this will explain very easily why embarrassing hadiths rise to the top, and that they don't actually indicate whether they're true or not. All they indicate is that people liked the stories. So that's a very different thing from it being reliable. So my second objection is the chain of narration, the isnad. It is objected that if we know the line of narrators and we know which of them is honest, then we can consider them reliable. However, if we look at this closely, what has been offered is not evidence, but ever greater claims and ever greater calls on our credulity. Now, Mansour, our common friend in Speaker's Corner, likes to talk about the chain of narration, and he can go into great length talking about so many different lines of narration and the biographies of the different narrators and so on. It sounds convincing. But what's really happening is what they're doing is, instead of offering evidence, all they're doing is making ever greater claims, which appears to be evidence, but actually is just weakening their argument. So it goes something like this. Storytellers fabricate stories. The story's reliability are questioned, so the storytellers fabricate a chain of narration. Again, the narrator's reliability is questioned. What do? They do what storytellers always do. They fabricate a biography about each narrator. Sounds even better. Again, the narrator's reliability is questioned. And what do the storytellers do but fabricate multiple parallel story versions and parallel biographies about narrators? All that's happened is the claim keeps getting bigger and more fantastical with each telling, but it's actually not a single bit of evidence that we can rely on. It is all just hearsay. So essentially, objection to the chain of narration is the idea that the claim gets bigger, but the reliability gets weaker with every new supporting claim. I don't know if you want to jump in on that.
Absolutely. In fact, this is, I mean, what you're saying here, all this makes sense, and also fits into what we've just been using in the last week. And I love what you've done by showing popular history, looking at what the popular culture is doing. I mean, YouTube is symptomatic of that. The most popular YouTubes are always the ones that are the show-stopping ones, the ones that are entertaining. And I would suggest this is one reason why when you look at stories of Muhammad, most of us who are Christian, we love those that are the most garrulous, the ones that are most, what we would consider the most embarrassing. And so when Muhammad wears a dress, or when Muhammad covers himself with semen, or Muhammad drinks camel urine, these are we just sit there and we love them because to us, they're absolutely disgusting. And so that's why there has been a whole, you might say, an entire industry of this within Christianity and also within secular atheist and humanist confrontation of Muhammad. It's easy to run to. It's easy to go to that because you know you can get a much bigger following. The difficulty is when you want to ask the much more deeper question, and we need to go to this. When you want to ask the much more deeper question, regardless of how embarrassing he is, are the story really accurate? And should we be careful about jumping and running to that which is probably the most entertaining, which will get us the biggest following? Should we be careful? Because that, if you're going to use that criteria, you'll have to use it on Jesus Christ. And I use this, and Robert Spencer brought this up as well. I use the story of Jesus in the infancy gospel of Thomas from 185 AD, which is just, you might say, such an embarrassing story of Jesus. He fights, he kicks, he even kills as a child. He kills people using his magical powers, his power. He does this, and it shows a Jesus that is heinous to the Jesus we know of from the first century. Now, if we want to, Muslims could easily go to that Jesus, or anybody could go to that Jesus, and that's the real Jesus. Why? Because he is the most entertaining Jesus. He is the one that really would get headlines all over the tabloids. Tabloids are dependent on that. But be careful. If we're going to do that, and we're going to say that therefore that's the authoritative Jesus, we then are saying, no, that's not the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus does nothing of the kind. He doesn't kill anybody. He doesn't hurt anybody. Wouldn't even let his disciples defend him using a sword. That's the historical Jesus. We must do likewise then with Muhammad. If you're going to use these later traditions, which are tabloid rich, they are, and you're going to get much profit off it, and many of us have used it for our own profit, then we must be careful that we don't, if we're not going to do that with Jesus, we must not do that with Muhammad.
Absolutely. We need to be consistent with that. Now, so in conclusion, scholars have shown that the Sunnah is historically unreliable and can't be used as a basis for establishing historical truth. Hadiths were fabricated for a wide range of nefarious reasons. Hadiths are retrospective and reflect stages of doctrinal development and are not a record from Muhammad's time. The argument from embarrassment and chains of narration do not offer any assurance that some hadiths are any more reliable than others. In fact, if any of them are reliable. And so to finish, alas, while the jest is over, many still believe these fanciful stories. So that's where I leave it. That's David, if you didn't recognize him.
Is that David as the Joker?
Yeah.
Listen, go ahead and stop sharing and let's just talk to each other. I think it's great. Let's go ahead and have the both of us here side by side. What you've done here, and I think this has been very helpful for all of us, this whole week has been centered on Muhammad, has it not been, Mel?
Yeah.
You have done.
Yeah.
You have worked for years on confronting the historical Muhammad, and you have done a great job with you and Murad and Bala and now Joe and now Odin and what's this girl?
Faye. You
haven't really introduced yet. We want to see her material, but it's fascinating. All these people who are coming on board and who are now looking at the historical Muhammad from the 7th century. You were now saying, and what's fascinating to me, and as I looked and see what you're saying, the Hadith really fit to an awful lot of what we see happening right through popular history and also popular literature. Why are we surprised that these embarrassing stories are there? They are surprised. They would be there because these are ways of the Abbasid Islamicizing. And let me just go through your 11 points real quickly and just do it and catch me on if I misinterpret you. The first one you said, and I thought this was brilliant, that these laws, that institution that existed from the Umayyad period, which were hated by the Abbasids didn't want nothing to do with them. They needed to then, now they've got the man and they've got the book and they've got their place. And so they got the book, the man, the place, and also the God. They needed to create that. They needed to take those narratives coming out of the Umayyad and they needed to Abbasidize them. You call it Islamicize. I would say they Abbasidize.
Yeah.
Bastardized. Yeah. I'm sorry. Abbasided. I mean, I've just created a new word.
Abbasidize.
Abbasidized it. And that's fascinating because they needed to create that narrative, which now stands to reason why from Ibn Ishaq to Ibn Hisham, 70 years later, that's what's going on. And then another 40 years after that, when you see that Ibn al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, and all these do the same thing from 870 and later, they are given hundreds of thousands, 600,000 of these, and they bring them down to their narrative, their Abbasid narrative. So there is the Islamicizing going on, and it's happening not over a 22-year period that we have always been told. It's happening over 240, because you need to go up to then Al-Tabari to get the commentaries, the tafsir, and also the tahqiq. That's 923, so that's the 10th century, so 300 years later. Then you go on to, you're talking about the evolution of this late series from, I've just said that, so that's actually point number 2. I put number 1 and 2 together. Number 3, you talk about the fact that there are fabrications, contemporary fabrication. You give these quotes where these are, I mean, if you just read what Hoyland's bringing up. Now, remember, Hoyland is important because Hoyland is the first one that I know of that's actually gone back to the original material and actually translated the original documents. Hoyland was head of department there at Oxford University when he did this. Islam as Others Saw It, this book here that I have here.
Yeah, he is no 10 hat guy. I just want to point out to David Wood.
Islam as Others Saw It. This is the book you're talking about. Huge book. He was the first to have done this. Now, remember, Hoyland reads and writes 18 languages. Let me repeat that. He reads and writes 18 languages. Wow. He was head of department at Oxford University when I got to know him, and I actually was in his office, and we went through some of this material way back in the 1990s. And you cannot fault Hoyland because no one else has done what he has done. He has done what the Muslims should have done for the last 1,300 years. You notice I'm saying 1,300, not 1,400. Why didn't Muslims go back and actually ask the questions you're asking right here, Mel? Why didn't they go back and show and find out which were being fabricated, which were being taken, which were being lifted, and then been accreted and deleted and really, you might say, rewritten to fit a whole new narrative, a whole new political narrative? So there's the fabrication. You talk about vested interest, and that was your 4th category. And that was fascinating. I've never heard anybody use this before, the idea that these were slaves who needed it to actually give them some type of notoriety in a now free world. And that's why they were the ones I had no idea that these were mostly written by slaves. That's fascinating. You'd be
Yeah.
think they would be the last to write it, because this is their way of creating scholarship. This is their way of getting their name out there. Then you also mentioned, this is something we have talked over and over again, and that is on almost every one of these hadith. This is your fifth point, is from the north. Remember, this is something David could not answer this. When I talked this with Hatun, she could not answer this. When I talked with Muslims, they cannot answer this. Show me something from the Hijaz. Show me something from that part of Arabia where Mecca and Medina live, exist. You can't show me anything from that far south or that early. And we kept on coming to the same. You've got to show me from the time that this all happened, from the person or the place that this all happened. Then you talked about the coins. I don't want to get into the coins. I would spend an hour talking about the coins, because the coins are the best, along with the rock inscriptions. They are really the best evidence we have for the 7th century, because they were made in the 7th century. They were made in Syria and in Iran, the places where these Muslims, if they were Muslims, actually lived and actually ruled and actually minted coins. They were minting these coins. Reference after reference of all kinds of people, but no Abu Bakr, no Uthman, Umar, no Uthman, nor Ali, nor Muhammad. So if these were the caliphs, and they were minting these coins, why aren't their names on it? Why aren't there images on it? And then you brought up this idea that beyond that, then you did talk about the fact that the images continue right up until Abdul Malik, and you see his image. Muawiyah has images on it. So there was this problem with imagery, this problem with iconoclasm did not exist that early. It's obvious that the traditions got that wrong.
Yeah.
The traditions are so clear that you can't have any images. Then what are you going to do with all the coins? Every one of the coins has images on it. And these were supposedly Muslim coins, but there's nothing Muslim about them. There's no reference. They're holding crosses in the West. They're holding fire altars in the East. So they're either Zoroastrian in the East or the Christians in the West, including, as we now know, Muawiyah himself. Muawiyah himself is holding crosses. Then you go on number 7. You talk about they cover up and they are photoshopped. And this is something that Hoyland brings up over and over again, that they are trying to Photoshop that narrative. They're trying to create that narrative that fits their image of their prophet in their place and, of course, their religion. Number 8, the Hadith support conflicting parties. And this is fascinating, because this political conflict, why are we surprised that there was conflict politically? Show me any empire that doesn't have conflict. By definition, historically, every empire, remember, Islam is not just a faith, it's an entire political structure. Has always been. Muslims were the first to admit that. So when you have these political conflicts, Umayyads versus Abbasids, it stands to read that the Abbasids would want hadith that support them. Now can you understand why it takes them 70 to, in this case, 110 years to finally put that together once they get into power? And then you go on number 9, that many times they had to force these hadiths. They had to actually force people, like Azuri says, that they were forcing people to write things that they didn't even know about or didn't even care about, or in some cases, didn't even want to write. So that enforcement always comes from above. And then the anachronistic, the fact that they just made something, they just got some things wrong. Al-Walid. How can Muhammad be talking about Al-Walid when he died in 715? Muhammad died in 632. There is a huge anachronism. Come on, John of Damascus knew it better. Then why is it we don't know it better? And then you talk in number 11, the rulings put into the Quran much later, and this is the case you have of the stoning, chapter 24, verse 2. This was put in there because they had to put it in there for their exegesis. Great done job. This is the kind of stuff that I love, Mel, because what you're doing, you've put together 11 really good arguments, strong arguments, and then you end off with your memes. And you talk about the fact that, listen, the Davids of the world and the Hatuns and the Sam Shamoons, and also Muslims, and this is not a Muslim argument, by the way, this is only a Christian argument. These Christians who want to continue with this, continue to do so, but be aware of the fact that the popularity you're getting may not be the right kind of popularity. Popularity comes at expense of truth. And remember that you are getting popular and you're getting an awful lot of people who are jumping board and they're clapping and they're giving you all kinds of accolades because you're demonizing a very important figure. I would suggest that continue to do that. Be careful when you do that, because you are bordering on hate speech. That is bordering on hate speech. Memes can be taken over and you can get out of control if you continue with memes. But if that's all you're built on, is that really the Muhammad that really existed? Why don't we go back to the original Muhammad? Why don't we go back to Iyas ibn Qabisa? I'd like to get back to the 7th century character. I'd like to see what was really happening in the 7th century, because I demand that of my Lord and Savior. We've always done that with Jesus as well. Our biggest argument, our biggest support for Jesus Christ has not been the later traditions, the Gnostic traditions, which make him look like a fool and an idiot and a hater and also a killer. That's not the Jesus I believe in, because it's not only too late, it has an agenda, and it has a Gnostic agenda. I go to the first century Jesus, and I demand that people do the same thing. You've got to come back to the historical Jesus, not the Jesus that's made up, that is embarrassing. You've got to come back to that Jesus. In the same token, we've got to come back to what was really happening in the 7th century. And we can pretty well know that this 9th century Jesus never existed, not in the 7th century. Beginning to, as you say, be put together for all kinds of reasons. You gave 11 different reasons. Brilliant on you. And we're going to keep unpacking them as we go. But can you see, at this point in history, 2020, we are beginning to destroy who this Muhammad was. We've done 2 things this year that have been dynamic. We've taken on the Book of the Man, the Book of the Man, the Book of the Man. I love it, because I have been asking for this for 25 years. We've got to take on the Book of the Man.
This is your year, Jay.
I'm sorry?
This is your year.
Well, and I've had nothing to do with it. I'm just sitting there and watching it. Everybody else is coming out, and all I'm doing is helping you guys communicate it, making sure you get it out to the public sphere, and using my channel to do so. You guys are doing the hard work. You're the one that are doing the discoveries. All I'm saying is let me help you communicate it so others can hear it, and then they can see and put the pieces together. The puzzle is being put together. We have an awful lot more to go. We're not going to stop here. This is going to continue on to 2021. But God bless you. This is what we need to hear. This is exactly where we need to go.
I do want us to point out that there are a lot of Muslims on the ground in these places that we're talking about, Iraq and Turkey and so on, who are contacting me and saying, yes, we've known this for years. So this is not completely tin hat stuff, as David would like to think. There are a lot of people with local histories who know a lot of this stuff, and we're just confirming what they've known for years. So this is not completely out there, you know. So yeah, we're just breaking it all open and allowing the wider Islamic world to know about these things, you know. So
here's the question we end with. Are we the myth makers? Are we the conspirators? Or are we the myth busters? Like you had you had Ghostbusters, we're the myth busters. And we'll take that word on board. We've been called myth makers by David and others, and conspirators. And I think that's been that was a great springboard for us to get and unpack it. It looks like the myth makers are the Islamic traditions. The myth makers are the Ibn Hishams and Al-Buharis, Sahih Muslim, and Ibn Dawud, and Tirmidhis, and Al-Tabari, and Al-Baidawi, Zamakhshari, Suyuti. These are the myth makers. Myth makers, because the Muhammad they're creating, these sayings that he supposedly said are nothing more than myths and legends. We're the busting the myths, and so we are the myth busters, and there's quite a few of us, and we're growing. And as you said, there are some even coming out of Iraq and Iran who are now emailing us and saying, listen, we're on board with you. We've always known this, but we've never really understood it until we've looked at the historical context. Always go back to see what history tell us. A myth maker are people who don't want to deal with history. They want to create something away from history. We are really the realists. We are the ones that go back to the evidence, and everything that Mel and Murad and Bala and Joe and Odin and this lady, what's her name? Faye are introducing. Everything they're introducing is based on hard evidence from the 7th and 8th century. God bless you. This has been great. Continue to write your comments. We'd love to read those comments. Mel will be on board. He will be looking at them. He'll be helping you to understand them. We'll try to answer questions from them, and we will probably do future videos trying to make sure that we get to your questions. God bless all of you. It's been great to have you on board. Thank you, Mel, for coming on. Thank you for putting such a great presentation. You've really hit the nail on the head with those 11 objections. Now it's over to you. This is Jay and Mel. Here in Europe and United States, we're actually 3,000 miles from each other. Over and out. Yeah.